So, on a scale of 1 to The Handmaid's Tale, how concerned are you about our country at this point? Are we going through the ebb and flow of social injustice, or do you think this is bigger, more serious than that right now?
Oh, this is more serious than
Mm.
that. Yeah, this is definitely an inflection point. Are we talking about Tennessee? Are we talking about Louisville? Are we talking about just the country in general?
Yeah, that's the sad part of the question. I could be talking about a lot of things, or I could
Right,
be referring to a lot of things
right.
right
So I
now.
just want to, before I start blabbing, I just want to make sure I'm talking about the right thing.
Well, before you start blabbing, let me thank our partners over in California. Celestina is classical music's wingman. By day, they're world class performers and studio musicians who've played on your favorite films. By night, they're on a mission to broaden the definition of what classical music was, is, and can be. More at celestina.org, and I'll talk about one of their upcoming programs here in a bit. Because you and I are going to talk a little bit about the Tennessee Three in the closer, in the
Hmm.
final movement, maybe you can offer your thoughts on the many other things that have, to you, warranted the response of this being an inflection point and not just another thing that we're seeing in the news.
After that shooting at Covenant Christian School, was it in Nashville?
I think so.
There were thousands of young people that flooded the area right outside the courthouse.
Hmm.
I really think that the reason that I think is things are different now is because the young people who have grown up having shooter drills are now getting to the age where they can do something about it.
Hmm.
Um, Young people who are getting chewed up by the financial system as they try to get a degree so they can go out and compete to get a home that they can't afford. How can you put somebody through this, through their formative years, and then not expect them to do something about it when they get to that age?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I think, because this is a groundswell of interest in the political process among young people that I did not see in my generation. So that's why I think we're at an inflection point.
Again, we'll get more into this in the finale, but when you talk about political engagement, the challenge for me is that if there are people that can be expelled from an elected office through process, through not by
That,
some rogues, but through an actual process,
yeah.
for me, that creates a challenge for me to want to engage, to want to vote for anybody, but I have to check my personal emotions and maybe see the bigger picture, or maybe dig into what I'm feeling. But to get this opus started a little lighter, I wanted to shout out Todd Harper, a local composer, visual artist, a fellow Buddha. He chants. Performed a graphic score concert over at Studio Z here in over in St. Paul, downtown St. Paul. I've of course performed many orchestral stuff, lots of chamber music, solo recitals, but this was the very first time that I can say I was put on stage in an improvisatory capacity. It was definitely different for me, but really incredible. Are you familiar with the tradition of graphic scores? Like
I'm
if
not.
I say that,
No. What does that mean?
so basically, music is mostly, at least these days, written down on Western notation.
Right.
You have staff paper and all that stuff. Well, many composers now are, and for a long time, but I've recently come onto the tradition of graphic scores where you have an image or maybe a curvatured line or something that you interpret into music. The people can't see it right now, but I'm holding up the score to a piece of music called "We All Need Copious Amounts of Water." So when I'm talking about a graphic score, this is the piece of music. So the way that this color blue meshes into this color green is something that I'm supposed to interpret musically. We don't have clefs on some of these musical things, but they're images of, or like bird beaks and that sort of thing. So how do I create something out of that? Anyway, really phenomenal show. I had such a great time, and I can't wait to get more into the tradition of improvisation. I feel like it's one of the final frontiers of classical musicians to actually play something that's not on the page.
See, that really appeals to me, because to me, the score as you see it on a symphony orchestra stand is way intimidating to me.
Yeah.
And when I was taking classical guitar lessons, learning how to read the music was the biggest sticking point for me. I had to go over just a regular tab to get through something.
Yeah.
So that appeals to me. However, I don't know if I have the command of my instrument to be able to just riff like that yet.
As many professionals don't, but
Right.
but
So
we're not here to talk about them. But
oh, okay.
I think another really innovative aspect of this performance was that not only am I looking at images and creating music, they're not posted on the wall; they're projected on the wall, so the
Really?
entire audience
Real, yeah.
sees what I'm playing off of. And there was narration from Todd, to sort of contextualize some of the improvisation.
That's very appealing.
Yeah, so it's a very new experience, a very new music experience, but one that I just absolutely loved. And I wish that there were more so-called classical musicians who would go into that world of improvisation and really creating music in the moment. How comfortable are you in an improvisatory space? You can talk about, acting, maybe musically, the improvisation of dialogue. Generally speaking, how do you feel about improv?
That was my bag. And one of my specialties was thinking on my feet, trying to incorporate humor without cracking yourself.
Sure.
All of that I did really well at. However, since the pandemic shutdowns and all that skill has greatly diminished. I've found the way that I communicate has really changed in a lot of ways. I don't know how I would be if you threw me in an improv setting, and we're talking theater. We already said I don't have command of the guitar yet to be an improviser there, to where it would be interesting for somebody to sit and listen.
What do you have to have command over to be a physical, like an acting sort of improv? So if we're not talking about command of an instrument, we're talking about command of the body, command of your mind, command of your interaction with another person. What are we talking about?
All of it. And it comes down to listening, because you have to be paying attention to all of the different ways that you might take something that somebody said. You could have an improvisational. I've been in improvisational sketches that were completely serious front to back, no comedy at all.
Sure.
It's taking the environment. It's incorporating history, current events, all different sorts of expression, music, writing, all that everything comes down to how you're going to respond in this made up scene.
Yeah. Yeah. So leaving that performance and that experience had me thinking about some notable improvisations that at this point have been recorded that I just love listening to, hearing how other people engage improvisation. So I wanted to share a little bit of that before we got going today. There is and I feel like I took a look. I couldn't find us talking about it on TRILLOQUY. I'm surprised that I haven't brought it in, but there's a bassoonist. His name is Paul Hansen. For decades, he's been known as like the jazz bassoon guy. So he has done, stuff that we would recognize as jazz, improvisations on the klezmer side, so-called world music, and everything in between. And years ago, he and some fellow musicians put out an album called Davka. And one of the tracks on that album I've been fascinated with since I was a freshman in college, when I actually met Paul Hansen. And in this recording that I'm going to share, the name of the track, I'm not sure how to say it. It's MNTI. That's, and I'll have it in the description for y'all to look at. But the way something like that. But the way he improvises on this track is just really incredible. And I want y'all to hear a little bit of this. playing that bassoon.
He's playing that bassoon.
How would you day part that or contextualize that for a more so-called traditional classical music audience? We got the instruments. It's not electronic where we're really talking about classical music, even, as the most traditionally minded person would use that phrase. But how would you, based on what we just listened to, bring an audience to that? Is there a first of all, is there a time of day that you think that music would be best received over sort of a classical radio medium?
Saturday night, 9 o'clock.
Okay, so yeah, that's good. People are feeling swifty. Maybe they've had a drink or two.
Yeah, because I can't. But yeah, probably later in the evening on the weekend, if it's a Friday or Saturday night, let's act like it.
Mm-hmm.
Because even people who listen to classical music like to, get classical freaky on the weekends, I guess.
Sure.
But how would I introduce it?
How would you prepare a listener for what we just listened to? Or would you just throw them in the pool naked, so to speak, or just throw them in the cold water?
There's shrinkage. I would almost try to take it out of the classical lens because classical music has you follow the score, right? There is no room for you can put your own emotive things on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Improvisation really doesn't come out of the classical school, does it?
And see,
am I talking about something I don't know about?
Well, and that's the thing. I feel like it's a part of the tradition that we've forgotten. I know how you feel about beepy boopy music, the whole Baroque thing. But in Baroque days, every one of those, why am I blanking on my music word? Cadenzas were improvisations, even within the written music, certain ornaments and ways of playing things were improvised. So improv is definitely a part of even the Western European tradition. We've just sort of lost it in our contemporary practice.
However, some cadenzas are written down and then presented as the piece, though, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so what do you do there? I mean, do you take the cadenza out and let the soloist freak it?
Well, as far as my first teacher was concerned, shout out to Lacoli, and he didn't care what cadenza was written down. He said, "You're writing one. You're doing your own."
Okay.
And I think the cadenzas that we have written down now, in many cases, are examples of what was so impactful that it got written down and then people just started playing it and that sort of thing. But anyway, the long way of answering your question, improvisation is a part of even the Western European tradition. We've just lost that part of the tradition.
So is there a notation for the sounds of the bassoon that we were having? Like if somebody were going to transcribe that down, would there be a way to slur the way that he would, put those notes together, or some of the more stabbing sounds that the bassoon can make? How would you write that down?
Yeah, there's notation for all of that, little squiggly lines between notes and, accent marks and all of those things. But at the end of the day, a lot of the stuff that Paul was doing there is stuff that only he can do or not many other people can do, which for me is what makes it so notable.
I guess that I would set it up as, what you're about to hear is where this artist is in their life, because every practice that he had, everything that he's heard, everything that he's played up to that moment of that improvisation is being represented.
Right.
So it's not necessarily just garbage notes, or like people make fun of abstract artists.
Oh yeah, just people just playing notes wildly.
No, it's not. This is marks where this artist is in their career and their life at this point.
Yeah.
So we try to set it up as something more along the lines of an expression of their skill and their background to this point. How about that?
And their lived experience, their engagement of what they're hearing immediately in the space, because he is playing in the same tonality as what's going on underneath him. So it's really brilliant. Anyway, what about you? Is there a notable improvisation or performance of an improvisatory approach that you think about as we're having this conversation?
Eddie Van Halen on the first Van Halen release back in 1974, there's about a 90-second track called Eruption, which is really just Eddie stringing together a bunch of different techniques.
Is the piece as loud as that title makes me think it might be?
Uh-huh. It is. And so you can, like I said, you can tell he's basically taken etudes, like exercises, strung them together in a way that makes sense. And it's become the benchmark of rock and roll guitar. And he keeps going.
Okay, Eddie Van Halen, we get it. You can play the guitar.
Here's this tapping technique here. I mean, he pioneered all that.
What else are we hearing in that? I mean, because as someone who's not trained on guitar, I mean, there are pitch bends and all sorts of stuff that's in there.
Sure, you can bend the strings up and down to get that, but the really big swoops down, what they have is a locking nut, and there's a tremolo that allows them to take all of the tension off the strings, and when they bring it back up, it's still in tune.
So to answer, sort of answer the question that you were asking me about Paul Hanson's improvisation, how can you write it down and all of that sort of thing? I also believe that Eddie Van Halen improvisation can be fully notated for someone else to play.
Sure.
Does that mean they can play it?
No.
Like, it's written down. We know what it's supposed to sound like.
Right.
But anyway, we're going to go ahead and jump into the intro and get going. But
that's right. We haven't done that yet.
Again, this idea of improvisation, I think, is just so important when it comes to the development of a more well-rounded musician, even a more well-rounded so-called classical musician. What kind of rock guitarist are you if you can't do any sort of improvisation? What kind of jazz musician would you be considered if you just can't improvise? I think we need to put that same pressure on our institutions, our conservatories, and all schools of music to teach the next generation of students to do this, because there is a next generation of music that composers are putting forward, that, folks leaning into graphic scores. Again, shout out to Todd Harper and all the folks who are doing that these days. It's an important skill, but even beyond that, I think about improvisation, the spirit of it, as what it really takes to move dialogue and move conversation. I've talked about it before. I'm going to read a short excerpt from this book called Reaching Beyond. It's dialogue among Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and the Buddhist philosopher Daisaku Ikeda. Ikeda writes here in this book, it says, "Right now, at each moment, we can demonstrate wisdom and power brimming with joy. At the same time, one needs intense training and practice to cultivate the ability to improvise successfully. Leading up to a dialogue, I carefully study about my partner or partners, both out of respect for them and as an expression of my sincere desire for meaningful exchange. After this preparation, the dialogue itself is a matter of playing it by ear. Once a dialogue or musical performance begins, each unfolding moment requires absolute concentration." So basically, what I take from that is improvisation is so much, and no matter what type of improvisation we're talking about, musical, acting, dialogue, whatever, it requires rapport, and it requires a familiarity with the person that you're doing this sort of improvisation with.
It does.
I feel like when we talk about the issues of the world today and how we can dialogue our way, how we can improvise our way to better outcomes, there has to be an engagement of the person, of the human, really becoming familiar with the other side or the other viewpoint. And that's what I'm really focusing on trying to do. I could be in my feelings and just be all wired up and ruined by what happened down in Tennessee, or I can do my best to see and study and familiarize myself with the other side, and that's a whole nother conversation, this whole tribalism, but just for the sake of this, I'll say of the other side, so that I can figure out what dialogue I need to have, what words I can say that may shift things in a more positive direction.
I just had just one quick question, because I know that Wayne Shorter composed a piece called at least one piece, Terra Incognita.
Oh, yeah.
Where he put no dynamics, no any sort of hint as the way to play it.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some sort of an improvisatory feel even there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just rebutted something. I just answered my own question from earlier about, how can you be improvisatory within the confines of a classical music composition? And I guess that's one way, is to just put down the notes and let the musicians decide how they're going to embellish them or play them.
That's one of the beautiful things about improvisation. Sometimes you find yourself, or you answer your own questions.
Yay.
Anyway, let's jump in here. I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is TRILLOQUY, with an extra long intro this week. So we're going to hurry up and jump in.
That happened.
Thanks to everyone who listens in every single week. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you so much for your continued support. To new listeners, TRILLOQUY is a podcast that takes the phrase and the idea of classical music and expands it to include so much more, all toward the ultimate goal of decolonizing classical music. To learn more about TRILLOQUY, to take a listen to past opuses, and to contribute, visit our website, TRILLOQUY.org. Huge thanks to our friends over at Celestina, presenting on April 28th and 29th. Say Celestina as we envelop you in a stunning musical playlist specifically designed to bring on a healing ugly cry. Drinks before, nibbles to follow. Sometimes that ugly cry is needed, isn't it?
It is.
Probably about twice, not often, maybe twice a year, I need me a real good ugly cry.
Yeah.
And then I can move on.
Like snot bubbles and everything?
All of that. Sometimes even in the shower.
That's the best.
Anyway, Celestina is bringing that to y'all on April 28th at 8 p.m. at the Eddie at the Broad Stage, and on April 29th at 8 p.m. at Barrett Hall at the Pasadena Conservatory. And that performance on the 29th will be live streamed. So to learn more and to get your tickets for that, go over to celestina.org. Juan Pablo Contreras comes back to TRILLOQUY in the third movement today. Very excited to hear from him and to share my conversation that I had with y'all. In the second movement, we're celebrating Brandy Younger and Amber Run. Can't wait to get to that. Tennessee, God damn. We're going to do that in the final movement. But for right now, we're going to jump into movement one. All right. How about you get us started this week with the accidentals? What accidental you got?
Sure. Let's give this one a sharp. This is from the NewYorkTimes.com. Before I read the headline, let me ask you this. When was the last time that you were at a rave or some sort of a big dance with a DJ and the drop hit so hard that you just broke into tears and you just couldn't hack it?
It's happened.
Really?
It's
okay.
happened.
Oh, say more. Okay. No, I thought I was going to get a never. Okay.
Well, I think familiarity comes with it. So there are portions, let's say, of Scheherazade that when something just happens, like when one of those loud moments finally gets there, it's awe-inducing, at least in my experience, to the point of tears. I also think about what it would feel like for me to go to a live Beyonce concert, because we already talked about how I'm not spending $1,500 on a ticket. We don't have to recover that, but there are just certain tracks that I know in that moment and in the space, if that beat dropped or that volume cut up or whatever at the right time, it would definitely do that.
Well, plus you're in a big,
not meaning to stomp on whatever point you're trying to make here, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. But plus, you also have that, you're in that environment with a bunch of people. You're all having that same experience. And so everything gets amped up. I get that. So from the NewYorkTimes.com, I thought this was interesting. Daft Punk's Thomas Bangalter, I hope I'm saying that right, reveals himself as a composer.
Hmm.
After more than 2 decades at the forefront of electronic dance music, while in a robot-style helmet, the French artist is releasing Mythologies, a score for traditional symphony. And the reason why I asked you that question is because about a quarter of the way down into this article, he's quoted as saying, with electronic music, it's so hard and it takes so much time to infuse emotion into the machines.
That's interesting.
The soft-spoken and thoughtful Bangalter said from his home in Paris. So to write a chord or a melody and have the performers, the human beings, play it and have this instant emotional quality to it is really quite exhilarating. It's not the fight that you have against machines.
Just to make sure we aren't leaving anyone behind, what would you say is Daft Punk's most recognizable tune? For someone who says, oh, I've never heard of Daft Punk, what tune might they have heard at some point?
Well, over 20 years, they've got quite a few of them, but most recently would be Get Lucky.
Like the legend of the Phoenix, all ends with beginnings. What keeps the planet spinning? The force from the beginning. Love. We've come too far to give up who we are. So let's raise the bar in our car.
All right, just giving the people a taste of it there, just so that they know who we're talking about. Not to get us derailed too far. A few weeks ago, you were talking about how you could take the lyrics of a song and really just frame it through whatever you're going through in your life. When I hear, those lyrics, we've come too far to deny who we are, or anyway, go ahead.
I'm glad that you're getting that response from it, because for me, I can sing along with that and not get emotional at all. That's because it's banging.
Yeah,
that's because
it's
it's going. Nile Rodgers on guitar and his Pharrell. What's his name?
Pharrell. Yeah.
Doing the vocals on that. But we see this happen a lot, where someone who works in pop or rock music that might happen to be classically trained, they have their career as a hotel room smashing band.
Sure.
And then once they hit about 45, 50 years old, they start composing.
Yeah.
And start doing this more introspective stuff with, a dozen or more instruments. You also see people moving from rock into jazz, and they'll go over into jazz and they'll say, oh, here's all this freedom. We don't want to go back to where the chains are. We want to be out here where we can really express ourselves.
I view that a slightly different way, because for me, it seems like to be a composer, you have to cultivate the notoriety, you have to cultivate the money, just the
Right.
career status to be able to do it. I feel like that may be, not to discredit anything that you're saying, but I feel like I'm seeing a little bit of that. Maybe he always had a desire to be a composer, but had to sort of put it on the shelf because this electronic music over here is actually what's going to pay my bills.
That's
right
making
now.
the money.
Yeah.
And now he has the money to be able to write this. That's what I was going to ask you, is how you feel about that.
Yeah.
Because should a person have to slog for 20 years playing one genre in order to do where their heart really is, or where their dream really goes?
Yeah, of course they shouldn't have to, but that's just the unfortunate circumstance that we're in, both in our capitalist sort of structure and the way that intersects composition and orchestras and all of that stuff, but also when it comes to the status quo of performing arts institutions. New music, living composers have to fight against the dead, as Tommy Doherty was saying last week. It's the dead who they're arguing against and fighting against by way of the institution. So I think it's that double-edged sword that keeps folks like Thomas from jumping into composition sooner. That I could be pulling out of the air. His story could be different, but from the outsider perspective, that's what it looks like to me.
Do you think that his association with Daft Punk will draw Daft Punk listeners? See where I'm going? Will that draw Daft Punk listeners into his orchestral piece and then have them go, maybe I should check out Trent Reznor. Maybe I should see what Tony, the gentleman who plays keyboard for Genesis, Tony Banks, what his compositions sound like. Basically, what I'm getting at, we talk all the time about these other forms of music coming into the concert hall, and I'm trying to look at the way orchestral or those sorts of instruments are being incorporated into the things that you find at the hip hop and rock shows.
Yeah.
And how far off are we from doing something like that?
I think the track record to a degree is there. So this piece of music that Thomas has written is for a ballet. Not too long ago, we were talking about Solange writing music for a ballet, composing a ballet score. And of course, it was sold out. It was wall to wall in there. Beyonce herself showed up.
Yep.
So I can only imagine. I don't know how stanny, how much people stan Daft Punk in the way that we stan Solange and crew, but I would imagine that would be enough to get somebody at least curious in there to support Thomas and to maybe have their eyes opened, or maybe have it affirmed that they don't like that style of music. But either way, I feel like his notoriety in itself would bring a crowd.
It's interesting here that this quote says, "It's a break of the medium, but it's the same person." So if we were to use, for people who don't know, when you compose music in the computer, it's MIDI, which means you have triggers and you just put different instruments or different skins over that. So if we took Get Lucky and broke it down MIDI wise for like a string quartet, what would it sound like? Would you play it on a classical station?
I would play the original, I would play the straight up version with Pharrell, but that's another conversation. But what's beautiful, one of my favorite things to do, and I've talked about this on Trilloquy, getting to know a piece of music even better by realizing it yourself. You do the same thing. You look up the chords or the tablatures of a tune and play it, just to do it yourself. So, that's also a thing. But I think it's of note that we aren't talking about that. We aren't talking about a string quartet or even an orchestral arrangement of a Daft Punk tune. He is creating new music through that traditional orchestral medium, and just in his own way. So we talked about, Solange. I think one of the things I also wanted to jump into is the multidisciplinary approach what it's really going to take. So he didn't write, Thomas didn't write a 30-minute symphony. He wrote a ballet, which,
90 minutes.
It keeps the audience's attention not only orally, but visually. They're looking at the dance, they're looking at the set. Do you think that's significant? Do you think it matters that this isn't just straight up orchestral sit down music, but music that requires more of the senses, but offers more of the senses to the performance? I don't know. I think there's something to that.
I think that the newer audiences are going to expect more in the realm of makeup, sets, costumes, lighting, all of it. Because look at all of the different sorts of entertainment that younger listeners have grown up with at their fingertips. They've seen some of these things through videos, whereas my generation, if you wanted to see ballet, you had to go to the ballet. And that is what I thought you were going with. Is ballet an area that's more accepting for a pop or a rock artist to step over into that? Because it seems to me like ballet companies are the ones that bring in the new stuff more frequently. Am I wrong in that assumption?
Dance, I would say theater in general is more, or I say less affixed to Shakespeare and those folks. I think it's cool, and I think that the success of this will speak for itself, if it hadn't already. The New York Times is talking about it. We're talking about it. So he's making some moves. One thing I wanted to jump to before we left this accidental, at the very end, Thomas is quoted as saying, "My priorities in the world in 2023 are on the side of humans, not the machines. I have absolutely no desire or intentions to be a robot in 2023. There's absolutely not one reason I would want to be one." That quote sounds more pointed. It sounds like it has more hot sauce in it beyond, oh, I'm moving out of electronic music, I want to do something different. Maybe all of those years having the mask
mask.
on, people he felt like people weren't taking in his humanity. They were just, thinking of him in conjunction with these electronic sounds. I don't know.
Mm.
And again, not to superimpose anything on this man, but it sounds like there's some sort of trauma there, or at least a
Really?
reaction to a reality for him to just be so adamant about, I'm on the side of humans, not the machines. That's something that I would never say. I don't have that lived experience, but it feels unique to me.
Hopefully this will bring some younger listeners over into, or at least being more accepting to check out an all orchestral piece like that. And like Zachary Wolf writes in this article, it's a 90-minute piece.
Mhm.
So it's not any little trifle that
Right.
he just dashed off.
Yeah,
quick.
this is some meat
Right.
on these bones.
Yep.
Well, shout out to Thomas Bangalter. Shout out to Daft Punk and to the diversity of aesthetics and the music you've given to the world. To transition us to our next accidental, I wanted to listen to a little bit of the piece that Thomas
it's out?
Bangalter wrote. So it's called Mythologies. I'm sure the video, of ballet and that stuff will come out, but the album is out. And one of the movements, the fifth movement, is called Les Amazones. So the Amazon or the Amazonians. It has a nice aesthetic to it, a nice active feel. And we're going to sample it to get this into our next accidental. What do you think?
You can tell he's been in dance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean that very steady beat.
Yep.
And a lot of this piece, the whole 90-minute thing is very ephemeral. Very, what words can I use? Very curvy. Very soft and pillowy. That's definitely a part of it. But I think this movement in particular is just a peek into his past and to his experiences as that electronic sort of music creator. If I, I would not be able to say the name Thomas Bangalter, certainly not before today. So if someone asked me to guess the composer, and I hate when people compare, but I would think John Adams, Philip Glass,
Right.
something in that genre. So I love to hear it. We love to see it, and I love to hear it. So shout out to Thomas, and hopefully this won't be the last bit of orchestral music that
With
we
hope.
get from
Yeah.
this really brilliant music creator. All right, well, we're going to round out the accidentals this week. I'm going to have to give this a flat, and maybe I don't have all of the perspective that I need, but this really sounds ridiculous to me. I'm reading from Manchester eveningnews.co.uk. Police reviewing evidence after women dragged out of the Bodyguard musical at Manchester's Palace Theatre. Every time we talk about England, we're talking about some mess.
Yes, go ahead.
All right. I'm just going to read a little bit from this. It says, police are reviewing evidence after two women were removed from the Palace Theatre in Manchester. A performance of the Bodyguard musical had to be stopped early at the theater on Oxford Street on Friday evening after an audience member repeatedly sang over the top of performers. The show's producers had asked the public not to sing during the performance, with signs installed around the auditorium. First thing I'm going to say, something that me and my friends used to say all the time. If you happen to know the internet show Got to Be Real, you will get this reference. But we used to say all the time, listen, just because I'm singing over you doesn't mean I'm over singing.
Oh, okay.
And that's what I feel like we got here. We're talking about the Bodyguard musical. We're talking about the timeless classic nature of Whitney Houston. If you hear a Whitney Houston track, that moves you. You know, we were earlier talking about moving concert experiences. You are going to sing along. You're at least going to want to sing along, tap your foot, clap your hands, do something. For you, where does audience participation overlap respective performers? You know, because it sounds like that's the conversation we're having.
Let me tell you a story about the night that I was a young man of 28, 29, got back from a business trip, went right to the bar, had too much to drink, and was really feeling the band that was there.
Okay.
And there was maybe half a dozen people in the place because, you know, it was a weeknight. So anyway, they're playing all these songs that I love. And I'm singing along with them in total tribute. And I found out later that I was louder than the band and that they really wanted to hurt me.
Oh, they were mad.
So I understand the desire to want to sing along with something that you love and identify with because you feel seen. And those people are paid to do it. And you are not. Plus, there's a whole bunch of people sitting around you that may or may not be able to sing who went there to hear the person on stage do it. So I'm going to defer to the folks on stage.
Sure. A little bit more from this.
Is that wrong?
Honestly, I don't know how I feel.
All right, go ahead
about it. But I'll read here. It says, speaking afterwards, one woman in the audience said at least 3 police vehicles turned up with officers stopping the show during the rendition of "I Will Always Love You." Quote, there was a lot of heckling at Melody Thornton, the lead singer who was on the stage solo at this point. Her mic was cut and the curtain was brought down for the second time. A fight broke out in the upper stands as security tried to deal with members of the audience. It was about 10 minutes to the end after an earlier stoppage in the show as others were removed. So it sounds like just a lot of chaos happening, and they use the word heckling.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think this article is trying to get us to understand about the situation? Not that, well, I won't even put words in your mouth. Do you think it's more about, oh, these people were enjoying the show, singing along, participating, and they're being policed, versus, oh, these audience members bought tickets to be disruptive, to heckle these people, and they had to be removed? What's the story that you think they're trying to get us to understand? Because that's what's cloudy to me.
Yeah, that is cloudy. They said that there was another stoppage beforehand.
Right. So apparently a lot of people wanted to sing along and they had to stop the show.
And maybe they should have tried out. But I can also tell you, and you might be able to back me up on this, when you're doing a show and when I'm in a play and I'm in the mode and you know, you've got your groove going.
Mm-hmm.
A stoppage like that is going to cause you to cool.
Exactly.
And then you run the risk of the second half of the show not being as tight as the first, or as maybe you wouldn't even inspire people to sing after a stoppage like that. So, and we got to know what is heckling though? What do they mean by heckling?
The only things we really have, so there are a couple of tweets that they cite in this article from people who were there. Excuse me. So it says here, Tosh tweeted, quote, went to the Palace Theater in Manchester to watch The Bodyguard, and a bunch of entitled P ****
synonymous
started singing over the lead during the final song. A riot broke out, the show was canceled, and the police were called. At Red Army 1878 posted, just been to watch The Bodyguard at the Palace, and a mini riot erupted during the big ending. Show canceled, people being physically removed, and fights in the aisles. All because you can't sing along. Police at the scene. Utter madness. So I guess long story short, the Brits over there don't know how to act, or they're trying to police audiences to the point to where the experience is ruined for everyone, performers included, because being in the moment is against the law all of a sudden. So again, it's hard for me to know what side to take here.
Sure. My question to you is all the rise in all of this bad behavior, how much of the COVID shutdowns and such do you think has impacted our ability to act right once we get out among people?
That's a good point. My comeback to that, though, is acting right, quote unquote, might be something that we should divest from, considering all the time we spent indoors. We spent pre-COVID times in the concert halls, sitting there quietly with our hands in our lap and all of that stuff. Now that we're actually back outside, why not challenge those sorts of status quo and the way that we're supposed to act in a concert hall? It's the reason why I kind of feel like I have to straddle the fence here is because I think about the respectability that is superimposed on orchestral audiences and how difficult it's going to be over the generations to break people out of that. So on one end, respect performers. We don't want to ruin the experience for everyone. And on the other hand, who cares about the tradition? Why not engage in the performance in the way that you want? We've talked about here on TRILLOQUY before.
Yep.
Back in Shakespeare's day, they were eating what do you call the
Mutton
lamb leg,
chops.
mutton chops in the crowd and
Making out.
screaming, and it was crazy. You know, why not revisit that? But why just try to police audiences so much, especially audiences who bought the ticket? So you have the butt in the seat, you have the income. Why police them beyond that? You know, that's the sort of dual perspective I come to this with.
Last fall, we talked about this. I don't remember what Opus number it was, talking about clapping and not clapping, like in the middle of the music and all that sort of thing. And we talked about, are we going to bring in bleachers? Are we going to turn it into a baseball game now? Do we want to hear? I want to hear music at some point. My point is, people went there to hear this cast do it.
Sure.
If you want to sing it, there's probably a karaoke bar right down the street. So go right ahead.
You said, bring your ass down there.
I'm just saying, if you're to the point where you're overwhelming the people that are supposed to be doing it for you, then it's a different experience.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Igor Stravinsky would like a word.
Sure.
On this riot business.
Yeah. All right. Well, shout out to Cody from over in the UK who put this on our
Cody,
radar.
thank you.
We'll check back for updates and see what else y'all doing over there in England. Coin fights. Can't even go to a musical because folks holler. You know, I told you the one time I've been to England, we went to a Sunday roast and they were in there fighting.
Yeah.
I mean, full-fledged, like throwing fists. And I'm like,
and they were
wow.
related. Yeah.
Anyway.
Stay classy, man.
Shout out to all of y'all. Mind the gap. And we're going to transition into the second movement here with a little of the score from the film, The Bodyguard. So I didn't know this was an Alan Silvestri joint.
Me neither.
You know, that's cool. So a contemporary classical composer of note who wrote this tune called Security Measures for The Bodyguard. So we're going to listen to a little bit of this to get us to our second movement. Do you remember what the tune was that you were singing over the band at the bar?
I remember many of them. One of them was, I'll be your crying shoulder. I'll be.
And you were in there, give it up.
Yeah. I would not have been, people said they would not have been surprised to see me get up on stage and grab the mic.
You were feeling yourself. I live. All right. Well, we're here in the second movement where Scott and I are going to share a little bit of music that we have personally been spending some time with. How about you get us going? What you got for us this
Sure.
week?
In the spirit of trying to bring orchestral music and instruments, let's not talk about bringing other styles of music to classical. Let's talk about bringing the classical element to other styles. And you know how hard it is to get me to sit and listen to vocal performances. You know, it's got like choruses.
And you live
stuff.
here in Minnesota, so you're cussing right now.
I'm telling you, I'm not going to be very popular. But that's okay. So there's you know how you have various streams on YouTube? You know, there's the lo-fi study makeout hip hop channel and all that. So there's a series called Mahogany, and it's actually done over in England. And I ran across a pop band called Amber Run that teamed up with London Contemporary Voices, and they put together a a cappella choral version of one of their hits, I'm assuming. And when I first heard it, I thought that it was some contemporary band that you would hear on a alternative station.
Mm.
And I started to think, what would happen if they put this recording right after a Bon Iver track going into a Lord Huron track? Because that whole sound texture was there. So they recorded this video in an old decrepit building. You know, it looks like stuff still hanging on, you know, falling off the walls.
Sure.
They just sort of swept up a little bit, got the lights going, hit record, and let it go. And an interesting thing about this track is I went back and I listened to the album version of I Found, you know, their little pop radio version, and I did not like it.
Oh, you liked this better.
I like this better. And I'm going to go and check out what London Contemporary Voices are doing, what they're talking about. So you have the choral aspect there, but they're singing about something that you don't have to have read the poem. You don't have to have been alive during whatever battle that they're singing about. It's a contemporary issue, a modern issue with modern language that resonated with me.
It's beautiful. It's a very resonant recording, indeed. Yeah,
I must like reverb because that, you know, those recordings that are done in train stations
Sure.
that you can find, they just move me. They really do move me. I'm not gonna break down when a Daft Punk beat drops, you know, when the drop hits. But on something like this, I might.
sure.
In the shower with snot bubbles.
Well, shout out to Amber
Amber
Run
Run.
and the London Contemporary Voices. That's a great recording there. Well, last week, Brandy Younger, my favorite harpist, the person who should be your favorite harpist as well, came out with a new recording. It's called Brand New Life, a really incredible album that fuses together R&B and soul and hip hop, all with her very unique and masterful approach to the harp. There's an interview. I'll put it in the description for y'all to read, but I wanted to read one of the things that Brandy says is that creating this album has been a long time dream. I really had a lot of living to do before being able to execute it genuinely. The finished product is truly representative of where I am now, and it is an honor to convey that through the compositions of one of my heroes. The heroes that she's talking about, of course, is Dorothy Ashby, who was a trailblazing harpist in her own right. You know, so always more history for us to revisit and learn about. It reminds me of what we were talking about earlier when it comes to improvisation, that lived experience being a necessary ingredient in what you're putting forward. Well, Brandy says the same thing here, and it's an album that, you know, as I said, it's really incredible. She's been a musician who I have fangirled for many, many years now.
Right.
I had the pleasure of performing with Brandy, I think back in 2013, sometime in New York. But my favorite track right now, anyway, from the album is one called Moving Target. You get plenty of that harp, but you also get plenty of that soul and that just spirit that really pushes this sort of music in a new direction, in a more contemporary direction, and in a direction that's sure to get audiences well beyond the traditional classical audience. So let me ask you to put on your radio hat again. Is this also a Saturday evening sort of track, or are there other times of the, because for for folks listening who haven't worked in radio, when we're talking about different time slots in radio, we're really talking about different audiences and people who are engaging this music for different reasons. So I can definitely see the Friday evening, Saturday evening vibe that this music offers when if we're going to try to incorporate this into classical radio. What are some of these other day parts or other audiences that you think could benefit from hearing this? Maybe 8 a.m. on a Monday morning is a great time for some Brandy Younger.
I was just thinking 4:30 Tuesday afternoon. You're on the way home and you need something that is going to keep you up but not rattled.
And somebody been getting on your nerves all day, having a little bit of something, when you get in the car.
But also, if we're going to follow the conventions that a lot of radio stations follow, they've got their traditional programming throughout the week. And then on Saturday and Sunday during the day, they let their hair down. So maybe a Saturday at 2 or Sunday at 11. Basically, in radio, you're trying to match what people are doing when they might be tuning in. So that's the primary motivation that I'm using.
Yeah, absolutely. So shout out to Brandy Younger. I hope you will go check out that album, go support it. Brilliant stuff happening in the world of classical music.
That recording that you brought in with her Lift Every Voice, and then she went into some variation. Yeah, I've passed that on to several people, and that always gets really good reviews.
Yeah, it's a
really
great fire.
Release. Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get ourselves into the third movement here. Before we get into it, Scott, when I say the phrase Lucha Libre, does that mean anything to you? Is that something for you?
Meaning, do I know the person, or does the name inspire something?
Or any? Well, first time I heard Lucha Libre, nothing came to mind. That phrase meant nothing to me. So,
no, I just think free. Libre is free.
Oh, okay. Well, apparently Lucha Libre speaks to a style of wrestling that I wasn't so familiar with.
Is that the masks?
Yeah, with the masks
so far
and the kayfabe. Okay. Again, I had no idea of the tradition, but our friend Juan Pablo Contreras has recently written and several times now gotten a piece performed called Lucha Libre that melds the Mexican tradition of masked wrestling with Mexican aesthetics of music with what he does as a composer.
I'm listening.
There was a Southern California performance where folks who had never been to an orchestra concert before showed up with masks on and that sort of thing. When it was performed down in Mexico, I believe Guadalajara, musicians on stage wore the masks. So,
wow.
So Juan Pablo Contreras returns to TRILLOQUY to talk a little bit about this piece of music, his trajectory since the last time he was featured on TRILLOQUY. That was back before everything of 2020. So we begin our conversation there. And he's speaks also to the importance that he feels as a Mexican composer to shine a light on Mexican culture and to make sure that the communities that he aligns himself with have an opportunity to engage what he does for a living. I think it's a really excellent piece of music. We're going to sample a little bit of it here in a second, but he's also one of my favorite composers who's living today because he really puts forward that culture piece. It's not about just success in the classical music field in itself. It's about success tied with really bringing in the communities, really bringing in the culture, and making sure that everyone feels seen and learns and engages in a contemporary way. Love all the work he's doing and hope y'all enjoy our conversation. We're going to get into my conversation with Juan Pablo with an excerpt from Lucha Libre. Hope y'all enjoy this. And I'll see y'all on the other side.
Mexico, we're still quite a bit behind and really championing the classical composers, meaning Beethoven and Mozart, a bit too much. And especially for young composers, it's really difficult to just try out your orchestral writing chops. So that has been in the center of my mission. Something else that I did in 2020 and into 2021 was I started kind of like an online orchestration school in Spanish for Latino composers that don't have access to orchestration classes, which is a huge thing that you do have here in the States. And it was amazing. The community grew to like 120 students, and I did like 4 different courses, and we just studied orchestration. And that was a great way to stay connected and to also realize that there's a huge population of young composers that want to learn this material and that are not having access to it, and also having access to what I think here in the States, and especially the American Composers Orchestra, does so well, is allowing composers to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and actually experiment and not have the pressure of delivering a flawless score to an orchestra without ever asking questions. So I think both go hand in hand. Is like teaching how to do the thing and then also trying to create the platform so that it actually happens.
So I wonder how teaching and really being this mentor to so many people impacts your own creations. I know that we always talk about the best way to learn is to teach. Have you found that to be the case since you've been doing all of this work?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and we'll talk more about this, but I think representation is really important. And sometimes just having one person that looks like you or that has a similar background make it, whatever that means, that changes your career completely. And for me, it was one of the first ones was Daniel Catan, who was an opera composer, like probably one of the only Mexican opera composers who I met when I first moved to LA. He taught in a community college right across Cal Arts, where I was doing my undergrad. And I met him and I couldn't believe, like, he was Mexican, he was living in the US, and he was writing like music for the concert hall. And that changed my path completely as a composer. Initially, I wanted to write film music. And once I saw like, oh, actually, you can be Mexican and make it as a orchestral composer, that completely changed. And he was a very important mentor who then connected me to other key people that allowed me to keep going. But I think just having that approachability, I think that is also very important. As classical musicians, I think we could improve on that. It's like, I always say, like, why not after a concert, why can't I go talk to the conductor, like meet some of the musicians? Like, they leave through another door and it's like we're segregated and we cannot like really cross that barrier, which is the stage. And I think I really love orchestras that do allow that kind of community where people know who plays in the orchestra, they support them, and that's something else that I'm trying to do more. And I mean, social media is a great way to do that, but then also just being available to help others, in the type of help that I needed when I was starting.
Yeah. Social media is important, but since 2020, I certainly don't take for granted in-person interaction and conversation. I treasure that more than I ever have, since having to stay at home,
Exactly.
While we're singing your praises, I want to congratulate you on receiving the Vilcek Prize. I wonder if you could talk about what your plans are now that you've received this grand honor.
That was amazing. I'm still over the moon and super honored that I was one of the winners. I applied for it, so I knew, and it's a prize for immigrant scientists and artists. And each year they kind of rotate the artist category, and it had been 8 years since music had come up. So there's only been a couple of winners. I mean, from celebrity, there's like 2 prizes: the celebrity prize, which has Yo-Yo Ma has won. Osvaldo Golijov, the Argentinian composer, who's very good. And then there's a category where you can actually apply for the award, which is the one that I was lucky to receive. But it was just so meaningful, especially because it also came in a time in my life where I had just become an American citizen. So I also felt like, okay, finally, after 15 years, that's kind of how long it took me to become American, I felt like, okay, this is my home now, and I want to, have my art also represent that, and then winning an award that actually kind of celebrates the fact that I write Mexican sounding music. That also was huge for me, because it's not like they want, or the foundation is championing people who become American after immigrating here, but it's actually they're celebrating people who still value and celebrate their roots. So that I think that especially was super special, because I've received a lot of pushback, especially I went through the American kind of education system of like 9 years of school, like undergraduate, graduate, and doctorate degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And which meant I worked with a lot of teachers, and a lot of them kind of pushed back on my Mexican sound and were like, are you sure you want to be typecast? Like, you're going to become the Mexican composer. Are you sure you want that? And I was like, I'm sure. Yeah, that's what I want to hear. And I think we should be encouraged more to write the music that we love and that we want to hear. And for me, this was like a really cool, acknowledgement and recognition of like that I was on the right path in like continuing and being stubborn on, this is the kind of music that I want to write. This is the kind of message that I want to convey.
Mm-hmm.
So for all of those reasons, it was even more special than just any kind of award, but like an award that actually recognizes that, which is the essence of my music and what I do with everything, was very, very special.
Yeah, let's talk about that word America or American for a second. You've mentioned the American Composers Orchestra, and it's an organization that really does affirm the artistry of people who live throughout the Americas, not just the United States. I also understand that there's an orchestra, I believe in Mexico, that's the Orchestra of the Americas or something along those lines. Unfortunately, in the way that we all tend to speak, when we say that word, we are talking about the United States. But I wonder, what is your engagement of that idea as a composer? The fact that Mexican traditions are American, as far as, North American, next to the idea that, people will hear that word and automatically think of Stars and Stripes and Red, White, and Blue and those things.
That's a good one. And then especially thinking, yes, definitely I have struggled with living with that of like America being the United States and not just the whole continent, which is like North America, South America, and there's so many countries in between, and I think that is important to make that distinction. And also, I also have never felt comfortable with the idea that sometimes certain types of Americans get the hyphenation, like Mexican Americans or African Americans, but then there's other types of Americans that don't get, like, I don't know, European American or Italian American, where I think the States, the beauty of this country is that it really is a melting pot of a lot of cultures. And I'm sure most people have, one or two generations behind them, someone who was an immigrant and who came here to start a new life. And I'm always curious about that, like why some people do get that hyphenation and why we're trying to make these distinctions. So I like that. I like thinking about that. And I think, awareness of the fact that it's a continent and not just a country is important. But also, it also encourages people to think about the whole continent as one thing, and especially here in the States, there shouldn't be that amount of distinction between what are you, what is your hyphen. I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. I think
I completely agree with you. What it makes me think about, though, is the idea that what is American, as far as all of the Americas, we have the opportunity to really expand that for audiences as musicians, through our programming, through what we create. A piece in your catalog, Mariachi Lan, I'm sure it's received very different in Las Vegas than it may in Mexico City, or maybe it's engaged in the same way. Have you experienced a different reaction to your American music depending on where in the Americas you are?
Yes, definitely, especially from performers. I think I also feel they they relate to the music differently. Though my goal has always been like to try to notate the music, to write it down in a way where even if you know nothing about Mexican culture, you'll be able to perform it and make it sound, in my case, Mexican. No? So, but it is interesting when some performers know, let's say, mariachi music, and they can kind of inhabit that sound world and add more vibrato, or make it sound a little bit more traditional. Whereas sometimes some orchestras that are more from the States, make it more elegant, which I don't mind. I think it's okay. I think one thing that I do struggle with is sometimes I include indications of like play the solo in a more kind of raw, rustic kind of way. And a lot of classical musicians don't like to sound ugly. They're like, no, right. I've trained my whole life to get a perfect tone. I refuse to make it sound, but I try to convince them like, no, it's part of the mission of this piece is to make it sound like how mariachi music is experienced in the streets of Mexico. And in terms of the audience, I'm always surprised as to how people make connections with my music, even though it's very Mexican and sometimes very specific about like specific town in Mexico. Mm-hmm. It becomes very universal. People come up to me and are like, oh, it made me think about I am from Argentina, and it made me think about growing up in Argentina. And I think that's what I love about being a composer and writing music that I really care about, is that it encourages other people to think about the things that they care about and not necessarily have a reference point in terms of the type of folk music that I'm referring to, but actually think about their own folk music and what is dear to them. And I'm not taking credit. I think that's the power of music. It really is very universal.
I'm fascinated by the idea that you have to convince a classically trained violinist to, really dig in. Or I wonder if you've experienced the opposite. I know that stringed instruments are a part of, a mariachi ensemble. Have you ever had to ask a mariachi violinist to clean it up a little bit, or whatever you choose to use?
That is a great point. And yes, and I think, especially in Mexico, we have this, I don't know, the culture is like, if you're going to build a desk, the first thing you do as a Mexican is you throw out the instructions manual. Like that's the kind of approach. Like, I'm a carpenter, I know how to do this. So what happens a lot with orchestras, the composer, basically it's what we do is a set of instructions. That's it. No. And sometimes it is difficult to convince some orchestras to really follow the instructions and play what's on the page, and not what, because there is this culture of like, I'm gonna actually improve this part. I'm gonna add my own flavor, which, there's a fine line. I am all for interpretation, but also, we go through the trouble of really thinking about how to write out the music. There should also be, some kind of respect of that. So there have been instances where I would say like, oh, that you took it a little bit too far. Like, this still is classical music. I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to do is the medium is the orchestra, but the genre, whatever you want to call it, is, orchestra music, and not taking a mariachi into the concert stage. It's like blending the two things together so that it can be in a program with any other kind of music without that kind of expertise in the original genre, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When I'm trying to pitch my work as someone who is really working to reframe our use of that word classical, or the idea of classical music, I always talk about how an Indian raga is classical from that context.
Exactly.
Yes. And go all around the world. I've even started to make the argument that mariachi music is an example of the classical music of the Americas. Is that an argument that you would make? Is mariachi in itself, even outside of an orchestra, classical music?
Yes, I love that. And I think it should be more, it should be taught more like at music schools. I think kind of like jazz. Jazz is like kind of a standard genre that you can go to school and study and focus on jazz. I think, especially in Mexico, that it should be an option to really master whatever mariachi is, and I like that. I think it definitely is the classical music of the country. So Yeah, that word is problematic because it implies classical as like Mozart, but also it's like orchestra. But then,
Mm.
as you say, like in Indian music, classical music is something very different. And yeah, I like that you're making an effort to actually, take care of these labels and broaden them much more.
Yeah, certainly making an effort anyway. So, in addition to talking about, classic music of Mexico, there are other classic traditions. You've recently written and premiered a work inspired by Lucha Libre. The
Yeah,
listeners can't see, but it looks like you have some masks maybe
yeah,
in the
yeah.
background. For folks who have never heard of what that is, how would you describe it?
It's it's Mexican wrestling, and you can think of it like American wrestling, but it's more like each of the wrestlers is like a superhero. So they have their own mask, their secret identity. You never know their real names. Like they hide their identities until they die. So I've seen people like walking in Mexico City with their luchador mask on, so you don't recognize who they are. I once saw a guy with a three-piece suit having lunch with his mask on in like a very fancy restaurant. So it's more, I don't know, it has that mythological kind of aspect to it. And it's something that you can go watch every weekend in Mexico City, and also in big cities in Mexico. They have Lucha Libre. And what's really fun about it is that there's two teams. There's like the Rudos, which are bad guys, and Técnicos, good guys. But in reality, people just go there to have fun. It's a spectacle. It's something. It's not technical. Actually, if you want to improve your ranking as a luchador, as a fighter, it's based on popularity. So if people start to like you, your ranking goes up. So it's nothing to do with like how many matches you win. So it's more of a party. It's more of a spectacle where people go and just root for no one. They just want to have a good time, and they're screaming at the ring, and it's kind of surreal how fun it is, and it's obviously very colorful, very Mexican in that sense. And it's something that I grew up with, and I grew up going to some of these matches when I was young. And then after being involved in classical music so many years, I had this idea or this connection that classical musicians are almost like superheroes, because they do something very technically challenging, and then they need to do it in collaboration with a lot of people on stage so that the magic can happen. And in Lucha Libre, most of the moves and everything are choreographed. So it's all planned out. So it also requires that kind of collaboration, even between opposing teams, in order to put on the best show. So I thought about like, wow, why don't I write a piece where there's usually 6 fighters in the match, like 3 versus 3. So I eventually created new identities, new masks that I have made here in San Diego by a mask maker. And the idea is I set up the orchestra in a way where the 3 versus 3 would face each other. Each luchador has an instrument and it's like a soloist, and they have a theme, a melody, and those melodies are introduced, and then they fight each other 1 against 1, 2 against 2, and then eventually 3 against 3.
Well,
and the idea,
hopefully no instruments being smashed on any
no, nothing like that. But the idea is, we'll see. Eventually, when I recorded this piece in Mexico, the musicians did wear the masks themselves. When we premiered it in LA, it was a bit more problematic. So we just had like a pole with like a mannequin head and the mask on. But the idea is that as an audience member, you can go there and see these masks on stage and see how the themes fight each other. And we even like introduced, again, coming back to this idea of like really bringing in the audience. I went on stage and introduced kind of told them a little bit about each character. We played the theme so that you could get to know the type of music that each character embodies. And then they played the Lucha Libre piece which is a match. And so they could have an easier time kind of identifying who was fighting against who, and follow along a little bit better.
I almost want to ask if you are a luchador, but maybe you wouldn't be allowed to tell me, even if you were.
That would be awesome. That would be awesome. No, I have to be more fit. These guys are incredible, like incredible shape, and just the acrobatics they do, like how they jump on stay on the ring, and it's kind of really amazing, like how talented they are. So it's more, and it's something more, yeah, very choreographed, very visually engaging, and not violent at all. I think the American wrestling is a little bit more violent, even though there might be some acting involved. It's much more physical. There is just about like the looks, and then the luchadores come out and they say hi to people. It's more like an interaction with the audience, which again is something that I think classical musicians we could continue to learn from.
Yeah. You've piqued my interest when you talk about the difference in how this could be performed in Mexico versus Los Angeles. Are we talking about an issue of cultural appropriation, or did musicians just not want to wear a mask? What was happening?
Yeah, I think they didn't want to wear the mask because they're like, the size is like a one size, and but the fabric is amazing. It's very comfortable, but I think we need to work something out where we have different sizes, or can do like a fitting so that it's easier for them to see the score, right? Because that's also an issue. Is like you're also playing quite challenging music, and you need your whole vision. So I'm still working out that specific. I mean, I didn't mind that. I think it also looked cool to look at the poles with the mask. Like, it was visually very cool to see that. And I should also mention that what was also amazing about the premiere is that there's a lot of Lucha Libre fans here in LA, and they came to see this premiere. You know, people that had never been to a classical concert, a lot of them wearing a mask. Like,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was like you could see the audience with masks, and I love that. I think it might seem a little bit out there, but I think sometimes that's what classical music needs, a little bit more of a fun kind of aspect of, I mean, without making the music any less good, but just, I don't know, even allowing players to have more fun. I think sometimes we're a bit too serious about what it is to be a classical musician, and even for living composers, like, I think there's a lot of very serious music being written, and for me, this was an opportunity to have something that was more of a celebration, and that could allow everyone involved to have fun.
I would never imagine that someone in the United States who goes to an American wrestling match would be at all interested in going to an orchestra concert. You know, that there's sort of preconceived notions that we have around the differences between a wrestling audience and a classical audience. Is that same distance, from your perspective, present when you talk about a typical Lucha Libre audience member and an orchestral concert member? Is that distance as far removed as people may think?
I think so, but I think the fact that I created this piece really intrigued some very Lucha Libre fans to be like, hey, I want to go to that. I want to see how that is going to work, or how is this composer making that happen. And I think that's what happened here in LA. That a lot of people had never been to a concert before, but they were huge Lucha Libre fans, and they were very proud to see something Lucha Libre related in classical music, or in something in LA. So there was a lot of people that I got to meet, and some of them who actually knew luchadors, like, you know, and that is something that I'm proud of, like, you know, bringing those two things that seem like, as you say, impossibly irrelevant, you know, make it kind of happen.
So how would you sell this idea to a symphony, let's say in Vermont or somewhere in Canada, far removed from having a large population that understands what this culture is? Why is it important to put culture, even outside of music, into a music space?
Yeah. Oh, good question. I think because even though the actual Lucha Libre, you know, spectacle is something very flashy, and, you know, you look at these masks, they're very colorful. Each character has a unique identity and has kind of a message to convey. You know, like, there's a character called La Calva, who, like, death, represents death, but from the very Mexican kind of perspective, that's very playful. So my goal is, you know, as I introduce each of these characters and kind of give you glimpse of their essence as luchadores, that you as an audience member start to think about, what mask would I put on? Like, who do I identify with most? Who's my inner superhero? Like, what is my identity? Like, what are some of the things that I value and would maybe create or champion if I were to design a Lucha Libre mask? And I think those more kind of universal questions, again, bringing to the fore this idea of identity. It's in a very kind of fun and unexpected way, but at the end of the day, it's something that I think we all, the big questions like who are we and where are we going, I think are addressed here. It's also a battle between good and evil. There's a good team, a bad team, and thinking about that, and also encouraging the audience to kind of, the challenge is you have to identify who won. So whatever theme you hear most or near the end. So it also kind of really makes people also even to, it's almost like a Peter and the Wolf kind of thing, where you are really paying attention to some of these instruments as soloists. There's one of the characters is a timpani, the timpanist, which is not usually someone who plays a solo, or the piano. So it also encourages you to look at the orchestra in a new light and actually pay attention to the geography and the design of where are people sitting, who's going to help what character make the music come to life. And so there's a lot of things that I think are attractive. And it's also an opportunity. This piece was commissioned by the LA Chamber Orchestra as part of it's called the Sound Investment Program, which is like a year-long residency with them. And it was honestly, I think, the best experience I've had as a composer, because I was able to, in a series of salon events, share my creative process, which is something very rare for a composer. It's usually just turn in the final product, go to the premiere, go back home, and don't have that interaction. So I was able to interact a lot with their audience and explain all of these different characters and get to know about them in a deeper level and connect with an audience. And we actually ended up, to the people who came to these events and actually supported the piece, we gave them masks. So we also had like 50 people that already knew what was going to happen and were into what the premiere was about, wearing masks. And that to me is, very valuable, to also bring in an audience member to the point of having them come to a premiere almost feeling like they wrote the piece. So making, new music more of a communal experience was also very valuable.
I'm thinking about the placement of a piece like this on a concert. One of the jokes that I always make is that if I go see an orchestra concert and they, have created something that has R&B or hip hop, I'm going to go for that. But maybe I'll leave at the intermission if the closer is a Beethoven symphony. I wonder what your engagement with that conversation has been about, as generally, you create more music that speaks directly to Mexican culture. Is it appropriate, or do you see it as useful to have a piece like this on the same program as a Beethoven symphony or a Rachmaninoff concerto or something like that?
Yes, because I think it almost becomes, it's like, it's a technical term, sinfonia concertante, where it's like a symphonic piece with many soloists. It's kind of that. It's like a concerto for 6 soloists plus orchestra. So I think it can be, sold as a very classical piece, but at the same time, it also has that component of being something, as you were saying, relevant, something, that you can also see as a spectacle in Mexico today. And I'm also kind of like you. I usually for me, but I'm gonna tell you, I think it's not that I don't want to hear the Beethoven symphony. Maybe I don't, but it's that I think classical music concerts are too long. I think even for us that are, we're trained as classical musicians, for me, I can really pay attention maybe an hour, and then it's too much music. So and I think I usually at the intermission, I'm so happy with what I heard, and I'm like I was able to digest everything, and I'm ready to leave. Honestly, I think if you stay for a second half, which you should if you go to an orchestra concert, but it's just too much music, and I don't think it helps a lot. The whole situation if I think if less music was programmed, it would also allow for more rehearsal, which some, orchestral musicians are always, and everyone is complaining it's not enough rehearsal. We're putting together 2 hours of music in 3 meetings or something rehearsals. So I mean, we just got to this idea, but I think making the program slightly shorter with maybe more interaction with the audience, like explaining what's going to happen. That could be another perk about this piece, is that it really encourages me, the composer or the conductor, to go up and explain, this is what's going to happen, pay attention to this, these are these instruments. It really brings in the audience. It's not something that, it can work as a piece that is just like a standalone orchestral piece, but it also encourages more dialogue between audience and orchestra, which I think is very precious.
Yep, I'm with you. 1 hour max. Let's just make
1 hour.
that rule.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, kind of joking about it, but Beethoven, no, it's maybe a little bit less Beethoven. I remember 2020 was the big anniversary, 250 years of Beethoven, and all orchestras were gonna do Beethoven programs. But now we're 2023, and I'm still seeing I've been to a bunch of concerts where Beethoven 9, Beethoven 9. It's great, but there's so much good music out there that we also, I don't know, we need to help audiences get to know more music. I think, in my opinion, one of the reasons why Beethoven is so popular is because they've played it so much. Like orchestras have played it so much that audiences just say like, oh, this is the good stuff because this is the stuff that I'm always getting. So why not give them other stuff? And I'm sure they're going to love it just as much. So yeah.
I think when a lot of people, I'm with you there. I think when a lot of people think about Mexican culture as it relates to Mexican people, especially in the United States, there's this idea that everyone who is Mexican was born in Mexico or came from Mexico, when in reality, you have third generation, maybe even fourth generation Mexican people who are fully from the United States.
Yes.
I wonder if you've thought about the impact of your music, your music that speaks to Mexican culture for the sake of Mexican Americans. There we go with the hyphenations, but for the sake of this conversation, Mexican Americans who don't have that firsthand experience with some of those Mexican cultures. It seems like your music is not only a means of helping everyone learn more about this culture, but specifically people who have generational connections to the culture who may have never even been to Mexico.
That's an excellent point. And my experience has been, especially living in LA. I spent 6 years in New York, in between LA, New York, LA. And living in LA, I've met so many Mexican Americans that are sometimes even more proud about being Mexican or of Mexican heritage than Mexicans. And that has been really incredible, like how much they treasure their traditions and how much they want to support, cultural things that have to do with Mexico. So that for me has been very inspiring to look at like these Mexican Americans that are doing amazing things in the States and having such a positive impact. And now, definitely as a Mexican American now, one of my most recent pieces, which I wrote for the New Music USA Amplifying Voices program, which, since this was like my first really big orchestral co-commission with 6 American orchestras joining forces to premiere this piece, I wrote a piece called Mexicano, kind of like a play on words on Mexican and Chicano, which is like the Mexican American. And it's about my journey to become that, my new identity. But it celebrates Mexican Americans. And what I did is I combined Mexican American music, like the music of Selena, or like rock and roll, like Richie Valens, which was one of the first rock and rollers that was playing Mexican tunes with rock and roll, Tex-Mex music. Like there's a lot of great genres that have come about because of this mixture of cultures. And it's premiered with 4 orchestras thus far, and the audience reception has been amazing. People coming up and saying like as you mentioned, like I'm a third generation, but I always remember like going to my grandfather's house and listening to this music, and it really still speaks to me. So I don't know if it's responsibility, but it is a privilege for me to be able to, you know, kind of take all of this music that has a very meaningful place in my life and place it in the concert hall. Also to invite people from all places to feel more comfortable going to a concert. I think that's still kind of an issue of like, we think of classical music fans as a specific type of person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when this music is part of the programming, and it really encourages people to go and say like, oh, maybe I can go if they're talking about something that has to do with my culture, let me go listen to this. So that also has become very special, this connection that I'm now building thanks to my new identity, I think, as Mexican American.
Yeah. So how can people learn more about everything you're doing?
I mean, following me in all of the social media goodies. I'm always as JP Composer, and especially Instagram, Facebook. I've been releasing quite a bit of music now on both like Spotify and on YouTube. As I was saying, I recorded my second orchestral album with Universal Music. The first one was Mariachitlan, that was nominated to a Latin Grammy. What's cool about the second one, it has the piece Lucha Libre, and it's also my conducting debut on the album. And I think now you can find 7 tracks from that album available online, and we'll be releasing more this year. And again, with this perk of each of the tracks has an orchestral video, which is like beautifully shot with like 15 cameras on stage. And because I think it's very important for me to also champion the musicians in an orchestra. I think sometimes it's too much about the conductor and like who's leading the orchestra, but honestly, the real heroes here are the players. Like the music is very sometimes challenging to play and also to play together. So for me, that every opportunity that I can have to even like in this Lucha Libre piece, it champions, or it's not about like bringing a soloist from outside that's going to play in front of an orchestra. It's like, let's celebrate 6 musicians that are already, they sit at their usual seating places in the orchestra, and they're going to have a solo, and they're going to have this collaboration and communication.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like when you're a real fan of a band, you know who plays bass, you know who plays drums, you know everything about who's making the music happen. I wish we had that kind of approach to orchestral players, especially in your local orchestra. Getting to know the musicians and who they are. I think it just makes for a better experience for everyone. Again, I go to a lot of concerts just because I am a musician as well. And I always really value when an orchestra not only says like, this is your orchestra, but they really show it, and they really make an effort to like, here's a meet and greet, get to know the musicians, or have one of the musicians introduce a piece, take the microphone and say why it's meaningful to them. That kind of thing, I think is very cool.
That's brilliant. Well, my last question for you. So you've definitely made, over the course of your career so far, the point that orchestral music can open people's eyes to culture. I wonder what your thoughts are on continuing that work, maybe even in Mexico, beyond Mexican culture. Do you see a Mexican orchestra as a means for Mexican audiences to learn about the Black experience or Jewish culture or what's going on in China? I wonder how you engage the next step of the process, again, the orchestra as a window to the world in that way.
Definitely. I think that's a fantastic point. It's not just, I think by maybe celebrating one's own culture and making that important, you're at the same time already celebrating other cultures. You're celebrating the fact that it's okay to bring in your own heritage and blend that into your own sound, or to program music that does that. I think I personally really, really enjoy doing that. And so for some people, it's it's their first approach to that culture. Sometimes, in my case, I can speak about my experience, but sometimes people listen to my music and they've never heard about mariachi and they don't know what it is. And I think by writing a piece that really celebrates mariachi in a positive way or celebrates Mexico in a positive way can really change your mindset as a listener, as a human being, about how we think about a country, or a culture. If we hear African American music really blended nicely with orchestra music, can be like really moved and overwhelmed in a positive way, as to like, wow, I should really pay more attention or be more open to meeting people from this background, because this is really gorgeous. So I think it's a huge opportunity that we have as composers, orchestras, performers, to, as you say, like become a window, and to be kind of like ambassadors about the positive things that we can share. And at the same time, through programming, you can also communicate that we're all the same. Like we're all one people, and it's not these differences. Or to put it differently, we can highlight the similarities, from our cultures and our backgrounds. And I think we have a great stage to do it. Like orchestra music is a huge medium with a lot of people involved. There's a lot of players on stage and a lot of people behind putting an orchestra concert together. So I think I love it, and I like to see it, and I'd like to see more of that.
An excerpt there from Lucha Libre by Juan Pablo Contreras, a really exciting piece of music, a work that speaks to a very specific culture that can definitely bring in new audiences. In the performance I'm going to put in the description, you even have performers wearing the masks.
I'm here for it.
It's really phenomenal. But before we jump into the fourth movement, I want to ask you, again, Juan Pablo is a really favorite composer of mine, for the way that he really loops in culture into the music. It's not just a sound. It's not just sounds we're hearing, but it's experiences that we're hearing as well. Do you feel like, as a music presenter, it's significant or maybe even easier for you to put forward music that can do that? I don't have to be Mexican to really appreciate something that orchestrally sounds Mexican, because I have proximity to that culture. I live in the 21st century, where we have all heard something musically Mexican, and to hear that realized through the orchestral medium is, it just, from my perspective, it just makes it more relevant. When we talk about bluegrass inspired orchestral music, or even music like we were listening to Brandy Younger earlier, it just seems like culture is a very important thing when it comes to engaging audiences, and something that we don't necessarily get by listening to Beethoven, or even folks from the 20th century like Stravinsky and Shostakovich. There's history that is relevant, but aesthetically, it seems like culture, at least culture that, that speaks to our experiences, isn't always there. How important do you think contemporary culture, as realized through the classical medium, is and will be to engage broader audiences, certainly newer audiences?
Let's say that I was a composer, and I would have to, if I were a composer, I would not be focusing on that particular piece, because I'm in it and it's all around me.
That piece, that particular piece of the
Right.
the dialogue.
Now, for
Right.
example, if I were going to Mexico,
Mhm.
then I might include, some of that bluegrass or the blues or
Yeah, roots, all that. Yeah.
right, something from my interest. But seeing as how I'm a white man in a predominantly white community,
Mhm.
I would try to bring in things that would be universal to that person, like my experiences in nature, um, the influence that Steely Dan has had in my life,
Sure. Yeah,
or
you
that,
stand.
or maybe something theatrical like Dionysus,
Yeah. I mean, and
Shakespeare.
you're talking about predominantly white audiences in America. I mean, let's say you go back to Omaha and write a ballet score like the guy from Daft Punk did.
Hmm.
Maybe the audience would still be predominantly white, but I imagine that it would still be a different predominantly white audience if those ingredients of roots and blues and the things that you were just talking about play a forward role in the composition, and they know that that's what they're coming to hear. I would imagine that would get a different audience.
So, like, if I had some roots influences, the roots community would show up to see what I did.
I mean, do you think the roots community are hanging out at the concert hall now?
I don't.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. That's my point. So there's still even because talking about diversity and all that stuff is important, but I think it's important to also consider the fact that there are, again, people who connect themselves with certain cultures that have not been engaged, that we can engage through our composition and presentation of so-called classical music in the same way that Juan Pablo does that. I'm sure there are plenty of Mexican people in Mexico who go to the concert hall. That's just, the reality. I also imagine that a piece of music that highlights that bit of culture will bring in a broadened or different Mexican audience. And that's really what we're trying to get to, just to broaden this thing and to affirm more people's experiences through it, decolonize it, so to speak.
So something that you would write would include the Black experience.
Yeah, I'm putting 808s in my symphony.
Probably
yes.
your Buddhist practice.
Yep.
I know that you like winds and Stravinsky-esque sort of things. So
yeah, I will probably just have to condense it down, or just write a series of works.
Right. I'd show up. I'd buy a ticket.
All right. Well, shout out and thanks again to Juan Pablo Contreras, and we're getting into the final movement here, where we got to talk about some things that have been going on in the world. So people are using the phrase the Tennessee Three. So as I have just been Googling that phrase to try to keep up with the news and everything that's going along, I stumbled upon the fact that Johnny Cash's backing band was called the Tennessee Three. Did you know that?
That was a new one.
Yeah, I had no idea. So we're going to listen to a little Johnny Cash in the spirit of the Tennessee Three, that genre of American classical, and a tune that I think works pretty well for what we're dealing with. This is a Johnny Cash work called I See Darkness. Johnny Cash and the Tennessee Three getting us into the final movement of this week's Opus.
Well, you're my friend, and can you see many times we've been out drinking, many times we shared our thoughts, but did you ever notice the kind of thoughts I got?
Real quick before we jump into the subject matter, Johnny Cash, American classical or no? From your perspective, I'm not so versed in that. How important is Johnny Cash when we're talking about his style of music, the genre, the culture that he was really bred from?
He spawned an era. The sound of the train in the music was, and you talk about the Tennessee Three. When they first played "I Walk the Line," Johnny turned around and said, "Why don't you take a solo real quick?" to his guitarist. His guitarist didn't write one. So he had to be able to improvise in that moment, looping it back around to the improvisation factor based on, so he took what he knew of the music that he had already written and improvised a solo. So, yes, American classical.
Indeed.
Yes.
Rest in power to Johnny Cash. And we're here in the finale to sort of engage what happened down in Tennessee. For the people like me who don't watch any news, again, who sleep under rocks, who spend all of their time in their home studios doing other things, what happened down in Tennessee?
The Covenant Christian School shooting happened, and young people responded and showed up by the thousands in front of the courthouse. And the two Justins, the two black men that were ousted from their seats, tried to speak to the issues that their constituents were concerned about. Their microphones were cut off. So, and I don't know how this courthouse is laid out. There's something called the Well, and I guess that must be like a place to speak. I'm not sure how. So anyway, they went to the Well with a megaphone to speak, and they were voted out of their seats. One of them has already been voted back in by Nashville City Council.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Right. But the white woman kept her job. Of the three, the white woman kept her job. The two black men were ousted.
So I didn't know that one of them has gotten his position back, at least at the time of recording this.
Mm-hmm.
Does that for you change the situation, or say, whew, like, do you wipe your brow from that, or are we still dealing with something completely heinous and ugly?
It's different now. I saw this coming. They just put the two Justin's popularity just got put on blast.
Oh, sure.
People all around the country suddenly following them on social media.
This is when to put out a mixtape.
Yeah, no doubt. But I really do feel like this is different. I really feel like some members of the GOP aren't even hiding it anymore.
Yeah,
and it's going to hurt them.
So
I think it's going to hurt them.
The racists are going to racist. That's just the fact of the matter, especially the ones who are in public office. I think what's most frustrating to me, maybe we touched on this in the intro, but these gentlemen were ousted through a tried and true system, through process. It's not like it was mob rule, tie them up and throw them out of the state capitol.
Mm-hmm.
There was process and procedure that made this possible. And it makes me so irritated, and it makes me lose hope for, I even feel weird saying that, but it just creates a lot of dissonance in me when it comes to any sort of political engagement, even taking my black ass to go vote for any of these people, because it feels like I'm voting and supporting for a system that is built to do exactly this. Again, it was not some mob rule thing where they were just kicked out of the chamber. There was procedure that has been codified in the Tennessee state government, probably many states, that allowed this to happen. Why would I want to support that? Why would I want to support a system that can do that?
It sounds like that is the administrative version of a lynching, is it not?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. All right, I follow.
In my response, because I felt like I couldn't say nothing over social media or whatever when this happened last week. So I found a quote by a man named Robert Heinlein. He was a science fiction writer, a white man to my eyes, maybe not, but he's quoted as saying something that I think is just so appropriate. The quote is, "I am free no matter what rules surround me. If I find them tolerable, I tolerate them. If I find them too obnoxious, I break them. I am free because I know that I alone am morally responsible for everything I do." That resonates so hard with me, because when I think about my drama at NPR, there was never a denial on my part that rules were being broken. But as the quote says here, I'm responsible to my own values and to my own morals. How can I just go along with something just because it's a rule? And I feel like that's what the Tennessee Three were facing. I'm sure they full well understood the risks that were that they were taking on by taking the bullhorn into the well and participating in protests and whatever they did. But that's really their morals. We're talking about human lives here and all of these mass shootings. And that's what they felt like they had to do. Not to mention the fact that there are so many other more heinous rules that have been broken by members of that same body. And they never had to deal with any of this. I wonder what for you determines the line between I need to keep this rule and no, I can't adhere to this rule. I mean, is a rule just the end all be all?
Does it apply to everybody equally?
Yeah. Or I guess really what I'm asking is, at what point do you feel or would you feel empowered to break a rule for the sake of your values? Or have you ever dealt with a rule creating dissonance with your values and what you think is right?
Sure.
In your work or outside of your work?
Yeah, in both instances there have been, but I can't think of any situations where my opposition actually made any impact. There might have been a negotiation to where both parties got a little something of what they want, but like Larry David said, a compromise is what you have when all parties involved are dissatisfied. And I think that's where we got to in those instances. It's never been anything of this caliber of these gentlemen were going through.
So let's take this to the arts. We can engage this conversation and infuse this into what we're doing here, but it's so much bigger than that. Let's say you were the program manager at a classical music radio station anywhere, but especially down in Tennessee. How would you engage this? Would you engage this?
You say I'm a program manager?
Yeah, you're in charge.
Oh, okay. I am going to assume that I would have a staff in place that I trust their instincts.
So I guess that's step one.
And right. And I would encourage them to speak what is in their mind and their heart. If I go in there and I tell somebody, and I tell my host, this is an outrage and you got to go on there and you got to let people know and et cetera, it might not be the most effective way for that host to communicate it. So I would take the lead off of my talent to let them broadcast in a way that makes sense for them and speaks to the issues in a way that is true to themselves.
So let me ask you this follow-up. Let's say one of your employees doesn't want to engage at all. What is your response to that host?
Well, there's a conversation there about why they're not feeling engaged.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think if you were the program director and somebody said, I want to talk about nice things. I don't want to talk about anything that's challenging in the news right now.
Yeah. I will admit I asked you that question without an answer in mind myself. What immediately comes to mind, maybe I'm being hyperbolic, maybe I'm not. There were a lot of Germans who were good people, who were never Nazis, who said absolutely nothing and who did absolutely nothing as Jewish people were being slaughtered. There were swaths of white people all across the North and even the South during the Civil War who aren't racist. They would never own slaves. I would never X, Y, and Z, but they aren't doing anything in opposition. They aren't using their platforms. So maybe that would be my reaction to that person. And maybe I would definitely find a way to engage that in a less accusatory way, because I don't want to, I want to be heard. I don't want people to immediately jump to their emotions and to their reactions. But that's really what I think about when I think about the person, the institutions who don't want to be involved in the conversation. There's no such thing as being a bystander. You're either perpetuating a thing or you're fighting against that thing that's being perpetuated.
Understood. But even that gentle way of saying that can make a presenter anxious, nervous, and ineffectual at that point. I'm going to stick with my same answer and also add the theater component to it. There's a time when the director has no more say in what happens. You have basically, let's treat rehearsing a role, like being trained into your job and being seasoned and getting your experience. At some point, you got to take your hands off and let them do.
Yeah.
And if I can't force somebody to speak out on an issue that they're not comfortable with, maybe I've got somebody else on staff that's going to counterbalance it. That's I see where you're going, what you're asking, but it's difficult to just elocute like the two Justin, as well as the two Justins do,
because they're brilliant.
They're both going places,
Mm-hmm.
and I really think that their opposition have given them a digital bullhorn and a digital spotlight, a digital stage that they're going to blow up. They're going to absolutely blow up.
We'll see how things develop and what other news that happens, because America is on fire right now, it seems. But one thing I did want to just note before we close today, we bring up semi-regularly, 2 or 3 times a year, the famous Sister Souljah quote, "Where are all of the good white people?" All of these good white people that you're talking about, where are they when we need them? Okay, I'm not going to draw the race line when it comes to this issue, but what I am going to say is, where are all of the good classical music institutions? Where are all of the so-called good institutions of higher learning? And what are they saying? How are they responding to this? Today, it's 2 black people being ousted from their elected positions in state government. What will be the next thing? And what will be the next thing? You're saying this is unprecedented. What will be the next unprecedented thing? And the thing after that? And the thing after that? How long can our institutions, classical music or otherwise, be silent and not be seen as complicit in this whole thing? There are certain reins that I'm held by in some of my work, including my radio. Well, my radio work is pre-recorded. If I was live, it'd be a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm grateful that we have TRILLOQUY to speak to this, and not only just to wag the finger, but to inspire everyone in the arts to figure out how you can engage these conversations. There's something to be said about this. There's some way for us to infuse ourselves into this, because in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I would hate for this era in history to be one in which classical institutions, so-called classical institutions, were just silent. I think about something that, came to mind for me today. I was talking with someone. Let's talk about the civil rights era in the United States. We can automatically go to Leonard Bernstein as someone who, threw his hat into the ring and did certain things. But can we really name an orchestra or a conservatory or a school of music that was really participating in it in the same way that we can, front of mind, talk about Ebenezer Baptist Church or talk about, all of the figures that we always talk about, Rosa Parks, Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King, all of those folks. We cannot name just off the top of our heads, just as a matter of conversation, those classical institutions that took part in that struggle. We have an opportunity now as an arts industry to change that part of our tradition. I want people to look back on this time and say, wow, even the orchestras were involved. Even the orchestras were pushing back. But for that to be a reality in the future, we have to do something about that today. And we really have to act on it. So that's what I got. Again, I could come on here and cuss everybody out. I could go down the list of representatives who voted them out and personally give them a fuck you, or like I'm trying to do now,
right,
encourage people to, in whatever way you can, really participate in what's going on.
You have spoken both on mic and a little off mic and a little bit on mic about your idea of getting past just doing this work in music and having a broader impact in your activism.
Yeah.
Does hearing stories like this edge you closer? How are you impacted beyond just the music piece?
As I said before, the battle that I have to internally fight is not wanting to just stop participating whatsoever. Maybe that's why my karma has not yet led me to winning the lottery, because if it was several $1 million in the bank, maybe I'd just be in Ghana. and say, Scott, we got to record remote because I'm in Africa. For the record, I would be the one up late. I would be considerate of your time and your schedule. How about that?
Right. Very good.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate y'all. This is a rough time, but dialogue can get us through. Dialogue that can give us a little bit of reprieve, a little bit of laughter can get us through. And that's what we're trying to do here. Thank you, everyone. Always appreciate your listenership. We'll see you next week.